February 14, 1945, Silesia, Eastern Germany. The snow had turned red where the first man collapsed. He hadn't screamed, not out loud, but the sound had been unmistakable, a low grunt as his knees hit frozen ground, then a hollow thud as the shovel slipped from his hands. Private John Wallace stood over the shallow trench, numb fingers wrapped around a rusted entrenching tool. The Wehrmacht guard pacing behind him didn't speak. He didn't need to. The language of the rifle was universal. There were 17 Americans left, all taken during the Ardennes offensive, moved east as the Red Army closed in. Cold, starved, lice-ridden, they were no longer prisoners of war. They were laborers, expendable. That morning the orders had been clear: dig. They had not been told what for. But Wallace knew, every man did. The trenches were too short, too narrow, too cruelly measured. They weren't foxholes. They weren't artillery bunkers. They were graves. They were digging their own. The snow masked the stench of the pits behind the tree line, where Polish prisoners had been executed 2 days before. But the memory of the shots echoed in Wallace's skull, each blast a punctuation mark in a language he was learning too late. He stole a glance at the guards, 6 of them, all young, all silent. The one in the black overcoat never looked away. His rifle hung casually at his chest, but his fingers never left the trigger guard. Wallace forced himself to dig faster. Each scoop of earth bit at his hands like broken glass. He no longer felt hunger. He hadn't for days. There was only the thud of shovels, the scrape of steel on rock, and the pounding certainty in his chest that this was it. This was how they'd end. Then from the east came a sound none of them had expected. Distant at first like thunder rolling in reverse, but it didn't fade. It grew. Slow at first, then rising, echoing off the frozen trees. Engines. But not German, not American. T-34s, Soviet armor. And just like that, everything changed. The guard in the overcoat froze. He raised binoculars, swore, shouted something in clipped German, and the others moved not toward the Americans but away, toward a truck, toward the forest, toward escape. Wallace didn't move, couldn't. His hands clutched the shovel handle like it was part of him. He looked at the hole he had been digging, shallow, unfinished. Above him the sky was still gray, the earth still cold, but something had cracked. He wasn't dead, not yet. And then the tanks came through the trees. Olive-green monsters crawling through snowdrifts, their hulls streaked with mud and blood. Red stars painted on the sides. Russian infantry behind them, rifles at the ready. The Americans didn't cheer. There was no breath left in them for that. They just stood there, shovels in hand, watching as the men who might be their saviors advanced with rifles raised, and expressions that didn't look entirely friendly. Wallace saw it first, the way the Russians hesitated, the way they looked at the Americans, dirty, ragged, standing beside graves they themselves had dug. One Russian shouted to his commander, gestured at the trenches, at the Americans, at the retreating Germans. Then the order came, sharp, absolute. A single command in Russian that none of the Americans understood. But the effect was immediate. The Soviets turned and opened fire. Not on the Americans, on the German guards. Rifles cracked. One of the fleeing guards spun and dropped. Another tried to reach the truck and made it halfway before a burst of fire from a Degtyaryov mowed him down. The man in the overcoat, the one who had watched so calmly, raised his hands and froze. It didn't save him. A Russian stepped forward with a pistol and shot him once cleanly in the chest. The guard fell backward into the snow, mouth open in surprise. The silence after was enormous. Wallace's breath came in short gasps. He felt his knees buckle but didn't fall. A Russian officer approached, young, hardened. He looked Wallace in the eye, then down at the grave, then back. He said something in Russian, calm, measured. Wallace shook his head. "I don't understand." The officer repeated it, then pointed at the trench, then pointed at Wallace's shovel. There was a pause. Then slowly, the Russian officer took the shovel from Wallace's hands and hurled it into the trees. The Americans were no longer digging. They were no longer prisoners. Not of the Germans, and not for now of the Soviets. But the silence that followed held no promises. Only questions. Because in that moment, when the graves went unfinished and the German guards lay still in the snow, the Americans weren't sure if they had been saved, or simply passed from one captor to another. They were alive, but they were still in hell. And hell had just changed flags. The snow didn't stop. Even after the last shot was fired, after the last Wehrmacht guard collapsed into the powder, it kept falling. Tiny flakes, soft as ash, drifted onto the unmoving faces of the dead. Wallace stared at them, not out of hatred, he couldn't summon that anymore, just confusion, a stunned, numb confusion that spread through the surviving Americans like fog. One by one, they lowered their shovels. Some let them fall, others, like Wallace, had already surrendered them. The Russians were moving now. There was no celebration, no relief. Soviet infantry combed the edge of the tree line with the same precision they had used in Poland and Belarus, weapons ready, eyes scanning, boots crushing snow. The officer who had taken Wallace's shovel didn't look back. He barked orders in Russian. A dozen soldiers peeled off and swept the perimeter. 3 others approached the Americans. The tallest, a rifleman with a scarf wrapped tight around his face, gestured to Wallace and pointed down the hill, then to the others. Wallace nodded. He understood enough. "Move." They obeyed. Feet dragging through the snow, bones aching from starvation, the Americans began their march, not away from danger but deeper into the unknown. The camp was gone. Behind them, the graves they had been forced to dig now lay untouched, abandoned like a discarded execution plan. Ahead of them stretched trees, ravines, and tracks, where Soviet armor had recently thundered through, pushing toward Breslau. No one spoke for miles. Not until the Soviets brought them to the first outpost. It wasn't a headquarters, just a collapsed barn outside a burned village. Inside, a field stove hissed, and the heat slammed into Wallace's face like a fist. A Russian soldier handed him a cup of something steaming. He looked down. Barley, cabbage, meat maybe floating in the greasy broth. It didn't matter. Wallace drank. So did the others. They ate with shaking hands, grunts of thanks in a dozen broken languages. For the first time in weeks, they weren't being shouted at. They weren't being used. They weren't being shot at. But they weren't being told anything either. And that silence, it haunted Wallace worse than the cold. What now? Were they still prisoners? Were they free? What had the Russians seen when they first arrived? Men digging their own graves, collaborators, victims. Nobody told them. Not that night. Not the next day either, when they were loaded into the back of a Soviet truck and driven for hours, packed tight between crates of munitions and a silent Russian gunner who didn't blink. They passed wrecked towns, artillery craters, abandoned Panther tanks half buried in ditches, bodies frozen where they'd fallen, German, Polish, Soviet. It no longer mattered who was who. War had blurred everything. Wallace kept thinking, this isn't freedom, this is transition. Then came the arrival. Katinka, a village in name only, flattened by shellfire, reduced to smoldering ruins and burnt-out vehicles. But here, the Soviets had established a temporary operations point. More trucks arrived every hour. Russian infantry, artillery teams, Polish partisans, and prisoners, some German, some Hungarian, some from God knows where. The Americans were herded into a barn, not locked in, just told to stay. A translator finally arrived, young, nervous, His Russian was native, but his English was solid. He looked at them like he wasn't sure they were real. "Captain Mikhailov will see you," he said, "one at a time." Wallace was first. The barn door opened, and the wind hit like a slab of ice. He followed the translator through mud, past corpses, past artillery pieces warming their barrels over small fires. Then into a schoolhouse, or what was left of it. Inside, a Soviet officer leaned over a map, clean uniform, iron collar, cold blue eyes. "Sit," Mikhailov said in English. Wallace sat. "You were captured by the Germans." "Yes, sir." "When?" "Late December, Bostonia." "Americans, 101st." "No, 106th." Mikhailov marked something on the map. "And your treatment?" Wallace hesitated. "We dug our own graves." Mikhailov didn't react, just nodded. "You are free now, but not safe." Wallace frowned. "What does that mean?" "You are deep inside Soviet operational territory. You are surrounded by war. We cannot send you back." Silence. "Not yet," Mikhailov added, "but perhaps soon." Wallace looked up. "So we're prisoners?" "No, but you are not free either." The words settled like dust. Mikhailov continued. "We do not trust everyone we liberate. Germans disguised themselves as French in 1941, others as Russians. We trust what we see, and what we saw was Americans digging American graves." Wallace felt his throat tighten. "We didn't have a choice." "I know." The officer stood, walked to the window. Snow drifted sideways in the wind. "We are not monsters, Private Wallace, but we are cautious. You will stay here. You will be watched. You will eat. You will be warm. You will not dig graves again. But you will not leave until we say." Then he added something Wallace didn't expect. "I buried my brother in a ditch like that, near Smolensk. He was never found. You were lucky." Wallace didn't speak. He knew better. Mikhailov turned, dismissed. The next weeks blurred. The Americans were housed, fed, monitored. Soviet troops patrolled their perimeter, but never with malice. Wallace came to understand that they weren't prisoners, they were evidence. Evidence of German war crimes. Evidence that the Red Army wanted documented. Each of them was interviewed, statements taken, names recorded. Then one cold dawn in March, a truck arrived with a Red Cross banner on its side. Inside were blankets, a Geneva liaison, and a list. Wallace's name was on it, so were 9 others. The rest would follow later. As he climbed into the truck, Wallace looked back at the Russians watching from the church steps. He didn't wave. Neither did they. It wasn't friendship. It was war. But this time, someone had drawn a line in the snow and decided not to cross it. That line had saved his life. And somewhere beneath frozen ground in a forest near Silesia, an unfinished grave still waited. A hole that never filled. Because one Russian officer had said no. The Red Cross truck rode silently over the frozen road, its tires groaning against ice-covered ruts as the convoy turned west. Wallace sat inside, wrapped in a wool blanket, his boots still damp, his hands cradling a tin cup of weak tea. There were 10 of them now. 10 Americans who had walked into hell, dug their own graves, then walked out again with frostbitten fingers, and a question that hadn't left since. Why us? The Russian officer, Mikhailov, had given no reasons, no guarantees, just the single word that had changed everything. No. No, they wouldn't die. Not that day, not in that field, not under German rifles. And now here they were, riding through the corpse-littered bones of a continent in collapse. None of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. The roads were lined with the debris of empire, burned-out cubilogens, collapsed farmhouses, scarecrows dressed in Wehrmacht gray still clutching empty rifles. Wallace tried to sleep. He couldn't. His dreams always ended in the same place, shovel in hand, grave unfinished. After 2 days, they reached Lissa, now under Soviet control. The Red Cross team had negotiated their temporary custody, but it wasn't release. The Americans were processed again. Lice kits, food packets, more questions. Where were you captured? Which unit? Did you ever escape? Were you interrogated by the SS? Wallace answered honestly, so did the others. But it wasn't until they reached the provisional repatriation camp at Dresden, or what was left of it, that Wallace finally understood what had really saved them. It wasn't mercy. It was documentation. Their testimonies, their names, their broken bodies, these were political capital now. Proof of German atrocities. Evidence the Soviets could wave in the face of the West when the time came to divide up Europe. They weren't prisoners, they weren't guests. They were bargaining chips. The Soviets fed them, cleaned them, dressed their wounds, but they kept them in a separate barracks, watched them, counted them. And then one day the counting changed. 3 Americans went missing from the roll. No announcement, no explanation. Wallace approached the translator. What happened to them? The young man shook his head. They're being questioned. By who? He hesitated. Not by Red Cross. That night Wallace didn't sleep. Neither did anyone else. 2 days later, one of the missing men returned, PFC Langdon. He walked like a drunk, eyes hollow, face pale. Wallace grabbed his arm. What did they do to you? Langdon just stared at him, whispered one word. Interrogated. He never said more. After that, the Americans stopped asking for explanations. They stopped making noise. They ate what they were given. They waited. Then, just when the frost began to melt and the world seemed to move again, the order came. They were to be repatriated. But not all. 5 names were read. Wallace S. was among them. The rest would stay behind. No reason given. No appeal allowed. Wallace hugged the others like family. The hugs were brief, firm, final. The train that carried them west was patched with rust and blood. It rattled over bridges still being rebuilt, passed through tunnels echoing with ghost artillery. Inside, Wallace sat beside a window. He watched the ruins pass. Churches without steeples, towns without names. One field held nothing but white crosses. Another was black with ash. He didn't feel relief, not yet. Only distance. Only the strange weight of not dying. The train reached Frankfurt on the last day of March. American MPs took them at the station. The first thing Wallace heard in English was, "You boys look like hell." He almost laughed, almost. They were processed again, given real clothes, a cot, warm water, bread that didn't taste like sawdust. They were clean, they were safe. But the grave was still with them. Even now, back on American soil, months later, when Wallace sat on his porch in Ohio and watched the wind move across the cornfields, it was still there. He'd close his eyes and feel the shovel's weight, smell the frozen earth, hear the soft crunch of snow under German boots. Some nights he'd dream of that moment. Standing in the trench, cold biting his fingers, the rifle clicking behind him. And then that sound. The engines and the trees. The Russians. And the word. No. The sound that pulled him back from the edge of death and hurled him into a different kind of survival. He never saw Mikhailov again. But he never forgot him. The man who hadn't saved him out of friendship or mercy, but simply because it was the right order at the right time. The war had 1,000 endings, some loud, some in fire, some in mushroom clouds. Wallace's war ended in a half-dug grave, and the silence that followed a Soviet gunshot. He had lived, but he would never stop asking himself why. And no answer ever came. He tried not to say the word lucky. When strangers asked how he made it out, when cousins came over with casseroles and wide-eyed questions, when the men in Washington with the armbands and notebooks sat across from him and asked him to just start at the beginning, John Wallace kept it simple. He said, "We were digging." He said, "Then the Russians came." He said, "And they didn't kill us." But he never said lucky, because he had seen what it looked like when luck ran out. In the months that followed his return, Wallace was rotated through a blur of stations: Frankfurt, Paris, New York Harbor, a processing center in New Jersey where doctors poked him like meat on a hook and asked if he still had dreams of gunfire. He lied. Of course he did. But they didn't want that answer. They wanted words they could put in a folder: closure, clean conclusions, statements signed in ink. He gave them what they needed. And in doing so, he left something behind. Something still buried in the half-frozen field in Silesia, where his grave waited, unfinished. He never forgot the others. Private Langdon, who never spoke again. Corporal Rios, who came home and drank himself to death in 6 months. Sergeant Gillette, whose family had buried an empty coffin because they didn't believe he was coming back. Wallace did what they couldn't, he went on. He married a schoolteacher in Dayton, had 2 boys, built cabinets, paid taxes, never once let his sons touch a shovel. But even in peace, the war sat in his bones like a cold draft under a closed door. It was the silences that got him. The long gaps in conversation. The thunder of distant trains. The sound of wind cutting through cornfields in winter. It always brought him back. Back to the line of men digging graves. Back to the crunch of snow under German boots. Back to the moment where death had a shape, a sound, a rifle pressed between shoulder blades. He never wrote it down, never told the full story. Until 1961. The letter arrived with no return address. Typed plain. Inside a single sheet. Comrade Wallace, if you are still alive, know this. I remember the look on your face when I took your shovel. I remember the wind that day. I remember the German officer's eyes. And I remember what I said to the men who watched. Not because I was noble, but because I was tired of digging too. There was no signature. But Wallace knew. He held the paper like it might vanish if he breathed too hard. He didn't respond. He didn't tell his wife. He folded the letter and placed it behind the photo of his unit, hidden inside the frame. Sometimes, late at night, he'd take it out and read it again, lips moving silently through the words. It was the only time he smiled when remembering. He never forgot the Russian's face, never knew his name. But he remembered the voice, the firmness, the refusal. That word. No. The cleanest word in any language. The one that ended the digging. In 1984, when Wallace died in his sleep, the letter was still there, folded, faded, but intact. His wife found it and asked their eldest son what it meant. The son didn't know. How could he? How could anyone know what it meant to stand at the edge of your own grave and then step back, not because you fought, not because you ran, but because someone else refused to let it happen? In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and archives opened like long-sealed tombs, a folder surfaced in Moscow. It contained a photograph, black and white. 10 American soldiers in ragged uniforms, flanked by Soviet guards. In the background, shallow pits in the snow. A line scrawled in Russian across the top. Amerikanske s vidteli, Ostavit v Zhivik. American witnesses, "Leave alive." The folder had been forgotten for decades. But the order, the one that had no name, no fame, no fanfare, had outlived the empire. It had outlived the war. And in a frozen grave that had never been filled, in a corner of history no one wrote poems about, a truth remained. Sometimes survival isn't earned. It's allowed. And for John Wallace, survivor, husband, father, ghost, that was enough. Years later, when the war had been reduced to textbooks and speeches, John Wallace's name would be buried among the footnotes. No statues. No ceremonies. Not even a footpath named after him in his hometown. But his shovel remained. The one he hadn't finished digging with. The one the Russian officer took from his hands and hurled into the forest like it was poison. It was recovered months later, buried under half a foot of thawing snow near the edge of the tree line in Silesia, by a Red Cross investigator. Rust had bloomed across the blade. The wooden handle had begun to splinter. Still, someone had tagged it, filed it, stored it. In the archive slip, the item was listed plainly. American POW tool, evidence of execution site. But Wallace had never called it a tool. To him, it was a sentence. One interrupted. One left incomplete. He never saw the forest again, never asked to. Some stories didn't need closure, they needed space. In the end, what stayed with him wasn't the cold, or the fear, or the gun clicking behind his ear. It was the voice that had said no. The hand that had taken the shovel. The look on the Russian's face, tired, cold, but certain. Some men live because they fight. Some because they run. Others because someone else decides they should. Wallace never made peace with that. But he lived anyway. Because history had paused for a breath. And in that pause, a life continued. He had dug the edge of his grave. Then someone had filled it, not with earth but with a decision. A single order. One that changed everything. And after that, he never picked up a shovel again. It was years later, long after the children had grown and the war had been turned into lessons for high school history books, that the knock came. Not a loud one, not official, just 3 measured taps on the door of the small farmhouse outside Dayton, early April, late morning, a day like any other. John Wallace opened it expecting a neighbor, maybe a salesman. He found instead a man in his late 50s, straight-backed, clean-shaven, coat too formal for Ohio. The man didn't speak at first. He just looked at Wallace as though confirming something long wondered. Then he held out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I was told you'd want this." Wallace blinked. "What is it?" The man's accent was faint, Russian maybe, but softer, worn down over time. "I don't know what to call it, but I think it belongs to you." Wallace hesitated, then took the package. Inside was a photograph, yellowed, curled at the edges. It showed 10 American soldiers in rags standing in front of a trench barely knee-deep. Snow everywhere. Behind them, half a dozen Soviet infantry. In the center of the photo, a young Russian officer, gloved hand resting on a shovel. Wallace's breath caught. The trench. The day. The man. He looked up sharply, but the visitor was already turning away. "Wait," Wallace called out. "Were you there?" The man paused on the porch, his hands in his coat pockets. "No, but my father was. He carried that photo in his chest pocket for 40 years. Said it reminded him that not every order he gave turned out badly." Wallace nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the photo. "What happened to him?" "Died in '79, heart failure, quiet." "Good man." The visitor hesitated. Efficient man, not cruel, but the war, it shaped people. Wallace ran his thumb over the edge of the photograph. "It shaped me too." The man stepped down off the porch. "He wanted you to have that. said he remembered the way you looked at him when he took the shovel, like you were halfway to death but still too stubborn to fall in. Wallace looked back down at the photo. He hadn't remembered his own face from that day. Now, staring at it, he saw what the Russian must have seen. A man too thin to fight, too scared to move, but somehow still there, still not dead. Still gripping a shovel. He looked up again, but the man was gone, walking back toward a parked car at the end of the drive. Wallace didn't call after him, didn't need to. He simply stood there, holding the photograph like it was heavier than it looked. For years he had told himself the grave was the ending, that everything after it, the cold, the recovery, the family, was aftermath. But maybe it was. Maybe the grave was the hinge. The page break. The moment everything turned, quietly, without permission. A half-finished whole. An interrupted sentence. A life paused, then handed back. And now, all these years later, in the soft light of a quiet April morning, he realized something simple. He had lived 60 years in the space between a German rifle and a Russian order. Everything else, the house, the job, the children, was what he had built inside that space. And it was enough. He folded the photo, slid it into the old frame behind the family picture above the mantel. Then he sat back down, picked up his coffee and looked out the window. The sky was the same color it had been in Silesia. But this time, there were no graves to dig. No rifles behind him. No orders to wait for. Just spring. And silence. And the life he was never supposed to have. And that finally was his own. The shovel had been made in Ohio. Stamped steel, World War I surplus, with a handle sanded smooth by weather and hands. Decades later, John Wallace would sit on a wooden bench behind his barn and hold that same shovel across his knees. It had taken years to track it down. Not the one he had dropped that morning in the snow that was gone, lost in the woods of Silesia, but the same model, same weight, same notch in the wood grain. He found it at a flea market in Indiana. The seller had called it decorative, told Wallace it was useless now. Wallace had smiled, handed him a 10, and taken it home like a relic. It wasn't the shovel itself that mattered. It was what it stood for. A life returned, a sentence interrupted. And now, with his knees creaking under the spring wind, Wallace would rest it across his lap like a man holding a piece of a world that no longer existed. He was in his 80s now, his mind still sharp, his heart steady, but time had begun its quiet siege. There were days when he forgot names. Others when he forgot why he'd walked into a room. But he never forgot the trench. That trench was carved into his memory like a groove in stone. 1 foot deep, 5 feet wide, 17 of them lined up digging in rhythm. No one spoke, no one cried, they just dug. He remembered the sound the shovel made in frozen soil, like a blade tapping bone. And he remembered the man who stopped it. Not out of kindness, not out of politics, but simply because he had the power to say one word and chose the right one. No. That was the beginning of everything that followed. Marriage, children, work, the 1,000 small mercies that made up a life. All of it born in the space between a rifle's click and a Russian's refusal. He thought of writing a letter. To Moscow, to whoever was in charge now. But what would he say? Thank you for letting me live. Thank you for letting me carry the memory of digging my own grave for 80 years. No. Some debts couldn't be repaid. Some stories couldn't be shared. They had to be carried. And so he did. The VA counselor had asked once, "Did you ever forgive them?" Wallace had stared at the man, the Germans. No, the Russians. Wallace had leaned back in the chair, eyes narrowing just slightly. They didn't ask for forgiveness, he said. They asked nothing at all. The counselor had nodded like he understood, but he didn't, not really. How could he? He hadn't dug the hole. The spring after Wallace's 88th birthday, his youngest grandson, a teenager with a camera and 1,000 questions, sat with him on that bench behind the barn. They were quiet for a long time. Then the boy asked, "Grandpa, were you really in the war?" Wallace nodded. "Did you kill anyone?" "No." The boy hesitated. "Did anyone try to kill you?" Wallace looked out across the cornfield. The wind rolled slow. "Yes," he said. "Once, maybe more, but once for sure." The boy waited, sensing something different in his grandfather's voice. Wallace reached down and picked up the shovel, held it, turned it in his hands. He didn't explain, didn't give a speech. Just said, "This saved me." The boy frowned. "How?" Wallace gave a tired smile. "Because someone stopped me from using it." The boy didn't understand, but he would someday. When Wallace passed the next winter, quietly in his sleep, his children found the shovel hanging above the mantel. Tied to it with twine was a note in fading ink. "Not everything that digs is meant to bury." They didn't know what it meant, but they kept it there. Because it meant something to him. And that was enough. The grave had never closed. But neither had the story. And in the end, both remained unfinished. Exactly as they were meant to.